Well, welcome back to our second session in our Intro to Biblical Hebrew course. We're right in the middle of this, introductory short unit on the sights and sounds of the language. Last day we spent our time looking at the Hebrew alphabet. How do we write the characters? What are their names? What are their sounds? What is the order of the alphabet? Hopefully that's starting to come together. And now we're going to push a bit further, but also kind of overlay that with a more focused conversation of vowels, and then how do those vowels and the characters we learned in our alphabet form syllables, which are really the kind of building blocks for all of our words. So by the end of today, we'll have more or less learned all of the characters, the dots, the dashes around them, to be actually able to read some Hebrew, which we'll be doing in class, and we can start working more on that on our own. So the sights and sounds unit is kind of laying the foundation. Before we even get to grammar, we need to be able to recognize and read what we're dealing with. So here we're going to start getting at some new material and some old, and I find that a lot of times in learning a language like this, whether it's Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic, it almost feels like two steps forward, one step back. You quite often press into something new, but the something new that you learn is really referencing back to something we've perhaps already touched on. So this is the first time we're going to do that, and we'll do it again and again. Now, in our first session on the Hebrew alphabet, we emphasized, or at least picked up on that idea that by its very nature, Hebrew is a consonantal language. In ancient Hebrew, as well as in modern Hebrew, in classical Hebrew is where we are in the middle. But in the ancient and modern versions of Hebrew, it's a consonantal language without any vowels. In English, we even don't read the vowels, but we could imagine how that could quickly get into some difficulties if we take the example of the English consonant D and G, and we were to imagine the different vowels that we could put in between those consonants. We get potentially a number of different words: dig, dug, dog, which all mean very different things. Now that's all well and good in kind of everyday conversation where we could sort out those types of issues. But what about when you're dealing with a sacred text, with a scriptural text, with a liturgical text? I want to look at two examples here that illustrate for us those differences, and then pick up on when we see that change happen from a consonantal framework into a framework with vowels to help make those decisions about how to pronounce a word here and there. So what we're looking at on this page are cross-sections of a few manuscripts, one of which you've seen before, but one we haven't. The top one here is something from the Cave 1 Isaiah Scroll, quite often called the Great Isaiah Scroll. If you go to the Israel Museum, or the Shrine of the Book today rather, this is on display. And this is the text, one of the largest texts found in Qumran, and it contains material from every chapter of the book of Isaiah. Pretty impressive find. Now, we've only been at Hebrew for one session so far. We're one chapter into our grammar, but we've learned everything we need to know from that one chapter to read this manuscript. If we were to go through this and transcribe the text, we would be able to identify every letter in this manuscript because it only contains consonants. It's an example of that ancient Hebrew before there were vowels. So here we can see there's our lameds, right? That characteristic lamed going up above the line. There's our final mems. Remember that boxy final mem? There's another one. There's our final nun. There's our medial mem. There's our tzade. All this to say, we have all the tools we need to read this text, at least visually to be able to read it, because all it is made up of is the Hebrew alphabet, those 22 characters we learned last day. So that's mid-2nd century, closer to the 1st century BCE. Now let's fast forward a little bit and look at something that's slightly later. This is another cross-section of a text that we did mention and did see the other day. This is the Aleppo Codex. Now, even with our whopping one chapter of Hebrew, we can see that this writing system is very different from this writing system. We don't know what they are just yet. We're going to get to that in a few minutes, but all of these dots and dashes in and above and around the characters that we learned in the alphabet session, most of those are vowels. most of those are vowels that aid in pronunciation. So when did those come into existence? Well, there's a kind of a quick story that we can give behind that we touched on last day, and it has to do with this group of scribes that we call the Masoretes. And the Masoretes are behind the Masoretic tradition of text. It's something you might hear about. This is a group of scribes that were operating in Galilee, in Tiberias. As far as we know, starting in about the 7th century CE, the earliest and best manuscripts we have from this school come from the 10th and 11th centuries, like the Aleppo Codex, like the Leningrad Codex. And what they did was copy manuscripts, but develop a system of dots and dashes, this system of vocalization to guide the reader in how the text should be read, how it should be vocalized. This type of thing matters for a text that is, again, scriptural and sacred to a community, and one that is used especially in liturgy in public readings. While they developed the vocalization system for that reason, a lot of what we know about the Hebrew language is based on Masoretic Hebrew. So while we are learning biblical Hebrew, the type of Hebrew we're learning is more or less this type of Hebrew. Qumran Hebrew is related, but there's a bit of a different linguistic makeup to it there. But almost every entry point into biblical Hebrew is going to be through Masoretic biblical Hebrew. So a lot of the things we're learning are going to be built off of not just a consonantal framework, but a framework that has vowel points included throughout. So we have just seen two examples of an ancient and a medieval manuscript to get a sense of how consonants and vowels can look in a text. And I want to show you just one more example, as well as introduce you to a resource that will be of some help throughout our year in Hebrew. What we're looking at here is a webpage from the German Bible Society, academic-bible.com. Now, these are the people behind a number of important Bibles and translations around the world. For us in the classroom, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia is one of the ones we want to know about. This is a printed edition of the Leningrad Codex, of one of those Masoretic codices. And most any English translation of the Bible today will use that as its base. We have that resource online available for free. What they don't give us for free online, some footnotes about differences between manuscripts. But for now, for our purposes, this is a really good resource to know about. You can go through it by chapter and verse. You can read through it. This is some content from Genesis, some content that we'll be reading together bit by bit in our class time. But for now, what I wanted to show us is when we look at this page again, by the end of today, we'll be able to recognize about 90% of the dots and dashes on there, and almost all of the vowels. So Genesis 1:1, we can read at least one line of this, and just to hear how the Hebrew sounds. Then we'll come back to it to see how it works with syllables later on in the lesson. So Genesis 1:1, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. So here we have that very first line of Genesis, right? In the beginning, Bereshit bara Elohim. So in the beginning, when, or in the beginning of God creating. Well, creating what? Et hashamayim, creating the heavens, the et haaretz, the heavens and the earth. Now, when we look at this text, we can see the consonants that we know from last day, as well as we can see all of these dots and dashes that look very much like what we saw in the Aleppo Codex, because this edition of the Hebrew Bible is doing just that. It's trying to reproduce the Aleppo Codex, or rather the Leningrad Codex in this case, for us, including all those vowel signs. So what are these vowels? That's kind of the order of the day. Here's a chart that we're going to use today, and then we'll develop a little bit in our next session to kind of add one row of material to it. But I want to walk through the sights and sounds of these vowels very much in the same way that our textbook did, to kind of dovetail with what was going on in Ross. And I want to look at this in a few different ways. We're going to see that there are three classes, or three types, of vowels in biblical Hebrew. three types or three classes. We'll talk about long vowels, long sounding vowels, talk about short vowels, and then these ones down here below, we'll get to in a few minutes, are vowel letters. These vowel sounds that are the result of a consonant or a weak consonant partnering up with a different vowel sound from up here to create a longer vocalic sound. We'll get to those in a minute. So we have long, we have short, and we have vowel letters. One thing we see here also is, if we kind of take the top part of this chart, these are the same types of vowels that we have in English. We're going to look at A sounds, E, I, O, and U sounds. As I said, next day we'll add one kind of line to this chart, but for the most part, this gets us almost all of the sights and sounds in the world of vowels we need to know about. One thing that's on this chart that I'm not going to touch on, but just as a reference point for your textbook, in terms of transliteration, I've given you notes here about how to represent these Hebrew characters and Hebrew vowels in transliteration, that is in English, in English font. We're not going to be spending a ton of time on that in our course, but since it's in our textbook, I thought I would include it for you here to kind of connect those dots. But for now, why don't we spend a little bit of time looking at these vowel points, and why don't we do that first by looking at the long and the short. So here's our long and our short vowels. Again, we have A, E, I, O, and U. One thing you'll notice right away is not every class of vowel has a sound for every letter type, but that's fine. We don't have to worry about the complete paradigm. Then we have a few less things to memorize. So if we look at the long, what we see here is a long A called a comets. The sound that makes is the long A that we might have in the English word father. Father. So the sound there with our bet would be ba. Father. Ba. If we move down one here to our short A, we have what's called a patach. And we have a shorter A sound there, like the English word bat. So to accentuate that with our English, or with our Hebrew rather sound, with our bet, would be ba. Ba, ba. Father, bat. So you can hear the difference there. They're both A sounds, but they have a differing length, either a long or a short sound. Now the same thing is true over on our E class, so why don't we just move over to the right a little bit more. Again, using our bet as kind of our consonant placeholder. Here we have what's called a tsere. And the tsere is our long E sound. A pretty close sound in English would be they, the A sound of the word they. You can hear that long E sound in that word. On the shorter side of things, we have our segol. And that segol is represented by those three dots rather than the two up here in the tsere. And the segol is again a shorter sound, something like in the English word better. So we had they for tsere and better for segol. So those differences with our kind of Hebrew consonant placeholder would be be or be. The tsere was be, the segol was be. So there's our A, there's our E. If we move over to our I, here we have only one to remember. We don't have a long I sound. In this class of vowel, we have just the short I sound. It's called a hirik, and the hirik is represented by this one dot under the letter. All of the dots in the letter, I remember, that has to do with our begad kefat letters. The dots within the letter are not vowels. That's our dagesh that we'll get to again in a couple of sessions to explain what that is fully, but for now, it's just there to aid in pronunciation. But the dot under this letter is our hirik. The sound there, that short I, bitter, if we had that just with our Hebrew kind of placeholder consonant, it would be bi, bitter, hirik. There we don't have anything to compare against, so all we need to remember is that one sound. Now if we move over to our O column, here we have two that might be a little more difficult to differentiate at first, but with some practice we'll get used to it. up top we have what's called a holum. Our holum is written by this dot above and to the left of the character. Remember, Hebrew is written from right to left, so if we're reading from right to left, we would first encounter the consonant, and then we would encounter this vowel marking up top. And the sound that this makes is a long O, as in the word roll in Hebrew, or in English rather. In Hebrew, that would be bow. If we have our B sound plus our long O, bow. Now down here is where things start to get interesting for us. We have, again, a short O sound, and that short O sound is called a kametz hatuf. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that this kametz hatuf is the same symbol as this kametz. That's going to be confusing for us for a little bit, but we will find that there is another symbol that's going to help us differentiate between those later on. For now, let's just work on keeping these within the boxes on the chart. We have our long O, bow, roll, and we have our kametz hatuf as a short O, as in the word bottle, bottle, or if we use our Hebrew, ba. So the holum was bow, the kametz hatuf was ba. So that's our long and our short O vowels. All right, let's move over to our last column, and then we'll move down the chart to look at our vowel letters. Here we find ourselves in that world of U-class vowels. So again, right here, we don't have a long vowel to remember, much like in the class, the I-class vowels. So all we need to remember is one vowel, and this one sticks out like a sore thumb. We have these three dots written at an angle towards the bottom of the character. That's called a kibbutz. The kibbutz gives us that short U sound, as in ruler, in the English word ruler. So if we were to take that B sound of Hebrew, of our Hebrew placeholder bet, and add a kibbutz to it, it would be boo, ruler, boo. That short U sound is what we're left with. So if we can go through that chart again in one fell swoop before moving down, the kametz was like father, ba. The patak, short A, bat, ba. The tsere was a long E, as in they, bay. The segol was a short E, as in better, be. The hidik was a short I, as in the word bitter, bi. The holum was a long O, as in the word roll or bow. The kametz hatuf was a short O, as in the word bottle or ba. And then lastly, we're back to our kibbutz, which was that short U, as in ruler, boo. So that's most of our vowels. That will get us most of the way there. But before we move on, we want to look at these characters, these vowel letters down here. Again, it's not a complete chart because not every vowel sound is represented in each of these characters. But these are those words, or those vowels rather, that were introduced in our textbook as kind of combination vowel points and vowel letters. These kind of harken back to some of our earliest representations of vocalization of Hebrew. So if we were to go study, for example, Qumran Hebrew, we would see that while there are no vowel points, quite often they would use these letters as vowels to try and point the reader in the right direction. Now what we're dealing with here is these letters plus some vowel points from the top half of our chart that we just learned. And we'll see that they represent some of the sounds we've already learned, but they perhaps give us a different way of doing so. I think it would be safe to say that these are not as common as our vowel points in the top half of the chart, and if we know the vowel points in the top half of the chart, then these will be more or less intuitive when we come to reading them in context. So for these ones, because they're based off of characters Hey, Vav, and Yud, why don't we take them in this direction here, all at once, based on the vowel and letter combinations. So here we can see we have a kametz Hey. You have a Hey plus a kametz, and that simply gives us that long A sound, father, or in this case, ba. Those two sounds, or those two characters, the consonant and the vowel are working together. Moving down the line, we can see the same thing here. A tserehe will give us that long E sound of they. So with our placeholder here would be be. Again, the sound is almost the exact same as a tsere, but it's just achieved differently by combining with a he. Same thing with our segol-he. Here's another E-class example where we have that short E from the word better, only with our Hebrew it would be be. There we have our segol plus our he achieving that sound for us. The Holum-he is one we don't see very often, but it's possible that we see this in some readings in the Hebrew Bible. Here, we more or less get the same sound as a Holum. Bo, and the same word that we used from before, roll, bo. And here that O sound is achieved by our he plus our Holum. So in all these instances, again, keeping in mind that 2 steps forward, 1 step back, we've learned all of these sounds. We know the consonants, we know the vowels, but this is just a different way of achieving some of those sounds. Again, we're not going to see these as often, and my feeling is that these are more intuitive once we get used to keeping an eye out for them, but they will manifest themselves at times in reading the text. Let's move down the line then. Let's look at some of these characters, or these vowel letters rather, that are formed with a vav. Here are 2 that we will see with some regularity. A holum vav over here will give us that O sound from roll, that long O, roll, or in our example here, bow. Moving over to our shurik. Here we have that U sound, where we had our kibbutz before. Here we can have a shurik, which is a dot within a vav, to give us that sound of ruler, or in this case, boo. Now these 2 we will see with some regularity, so keep an eye out for these holum vav. At times words can be written with a holum or a holum vav, and in some instances with a shurik or a kibbutz, so keep an eye out for those. In some places they're interchangeable, but for us, if we remember that they're O-class vowels here and a U-class vowel here, then that shouldn't throw us for too many turns, I hope. Okay, let's finish off this chart, and we'll look at this last row of vowels, or partial row, where we're dealing with vowel letters formed off of a Masoretic vowel and the character yod. Here again, we're getting similar sounds, just achieved differently. The first is our tsere yod. So by this point, probably no surprise, that's formed by this tsere and yod combination, and this will give us a long E sound. Again, they, bay, tsere yod, giving us a similar sound, or the same sound as the tsere he. Here's 2 more that are similar again. We're giving us the same sound. A segol he, or a segol yod rather. The segol yod here, we have that yod, that constant we learned in our last session, and our tsegol that we learned above, working together here to give us that shorter E, better. Be, be. So if this was be, this was be. Now, out of everything we've seen so far, this is probably really the only new sound that we didn't have represented somewhere else on our chart, the hidik yod. The hidik yod, as its name suggests, is formed by a yod and a hidik, joining forces to give us that sound of almost a long I, like machine, E, machine, we have in our English example. Or here in our Hebrew, we could say B, B. If our hidik on its own gave us that short E, that B, as in bitter, then here would be our example of a longer E achieved through a vowel letter to give us that sound B. Now if we stand back for a minute and look at this chart, what we see is, while this is new to us, almost everything in here is differentiated except for these 2, which we'll come back to, so don't lose too much sleep over that. And almost everything on this section relates back to what we already learned here. So my advice for us kind of getting into this would be, let's focus on this section, get that hammered down, and then we'll work on this as we progress throughout the next couple of sessions. But at this point, then, what we can say is we have learned the entire alphabet. We have learned all of the vowels, except for a few more dots and dashes that we'll get to next day. But for now, we are in a good position to start reading text, or at least understanding how words operate, which is where we're going to head next before we finish up this session. Because once we have the alphabet pinned down and we know our vowels, then we can actually start reading words. You'll notice that this week in our grammar, we have started to get vocabulary lists. Now we should have all the tools in place to be able to read those and start to pronounce those words, which are two huge things to be doing as you work towards memorizing those vocab lists. So the last thing we need to think about then is syllables. We speak in syllables. Every language works in syllables. Hebrew is no different. But how you detect syllables changes from language to language. And again, Hebrew is no exception there. So how do we detect syllables? How do we intuitively know how to pronounce words when we're brand new to the language? There are two types of syllables in Hebrew, and they're structured based off of two pretty basic principles. So in Hebrew, we have open syllables and we have closed syllables. The nice thing is that every syllable will start with a consonant. You will never have a syllable that starts with a vowel. So you'll always have syllables that start with consonants. Syllables from there on out may be open or closed. They may be open or closed. And what we mean by that is though they start with a consonant, they may not end with a vowel or a consonant, depending on the structure. And I want to give you just an example with a word here. This first setup here is what we would call an open syllable. An open syllable will always start with a consonant, as we just learned, and it will end with a vowel. So it's open. It's ending with an open vowel sound. A closed syllable, on the other hand, will do something different. A closed syllable will start with a consonant. It will have a vowel, but then it will close with another consonant. And we can see that working itself out here. This is one of our vocabulary words for this chapter. Da-var. Da-var. This word simply means word or thing or matter. The way we pronounce that is da-var, because this syllable here starts with a consonant. It ends with a vowel. This syllable starts with a consonant. It has a vowel, but then we have another consonant. So it's a closed syllable. Da-var. For now, if we can focus on identifying these two types of syllables, remember these kind of short and sweet rules. Again, with more practice, this will become intuitive. But if we can think about all of our Hebrew words in that frame of reference, either closed or open syllables, CV or CVC, we should be able to make a good way forward in how we split words up into syllables, and eventually that means how we pronounce words. So that's a few things on syllable types and syllable structures and how to break down words. We'll have more practice with that. But the final topic to at least touch on before we call it a day has to do with something we heard about in our chapter dealing with vowels, but dealing with one particular place a vowel could show up. A furtive patach was the term we're talking about here. Now, Ross introduced us to this idea where if we have a strong guttural, most often it could be a hey, a het, an ayin, in a few places possibly with an aleph, but we know gutturals kind of lump together in that category, so that's fine. Words ending with one of those gutturals may need a little help in pronunciation, so we might actually have another vowel, kind of a helping pronunciation vowel, show up, and it will always be a patach. And it will always be just offset to the right of this final character. Now this word here, even though it might look like we would break it up into different syllables, a furtive patach is the only place where we will have a closed syllable with technically 2 vowels in it. Now the word we're dealing with here is Noach, Noah, the name Noah, and you can hear that we pronounce that as a single syllable. It's not No-ach, it's Noach. It's a single syllable, even though it looks like we have 2 syllables per house because of those 2 vowels. Again, that's not something we see all over the place, but that's something to kind of put in the back of your mind as you read through text. If we have that patach, and we have that patach showing up in that position under a guttural, it's probably to aid in pronunciation. So that about does it for the sights and sounds of Hebrew. We'll have one more line to add into our vowel chart, a few more symbols to at least be able to recognize. But by the end of our first week, or at least our first 2 weeks of Hebrew, we should be able to read text, and that's something we'll make a habit of doing as we get used to not only recognizing letters, but seeing how letters and vowels form words and syllables, and eventually being able to read a text, even if our translation of that text is still something that is in the works.